Hello, everyone, and this lecture is titled Economic Inequality. I am Professor Gabriel Selassie. Now, in this lecture, what we're going to talk about is how politics and economics sort of intertwine with each other. Now, we're not going to go into a full, wide scope and breadth. In other words, we're not going to call up the history of American economic history and go through all the details about tariffs and all those sorts of things. But we are going to talk about just some basics that will allow us to kind of understand where African Americans fit within our American economic system. And this greatly influences American politics. You could probably argue that there is a symbiotic relationship between politics and economics, economics and politics. The two are so vastly intertwined that it's probably not even worth mentioning how they might be, in some essence, separate. So I'm going to cue up the slideshow here and we'll delve deeply into the lecture. I'm imagining that the lecture is going to take us probably about 25 to 30 minutes. So this one will not be long, but it will be, I think, in many ways, very fruitful. So the title, of course, of this lecture is Economic Inequality. And what we're going to be talking about largely is the racial wealth gap between groups. And there are going to be a couple of sources that you can use to sort of flesh some of this out if you're interested on your own, or when you go out and move on to your follow-up institution, you can use some of the or ideas or theses or supplement some of the stuff you're writing, because so much of what we do in the social sciences today involves economics that it's kind of hard to go through many classes, whether it be social sciences, political science, African American studies, Chicano studies, what have you, that in some measure doesn't focus in on economics. So these are pretty good places to start. You can look at the racial for assets and social policy. And there is the website. The good folks at Brandeis University provided all of this information. Now, what are the things that matter in American history as it relates to economics and this convergence upon Black folk? Well, one of the things that we ought to just lay this directly on the table, that Black people were instrumental in building the wealth of America. And what I mean by that is, of course, that slavery was the driving industry that made Black people wealthy. Now, you could probably make the argument that, well, slaves are the ones who were an integral part of it, but it really was cotton, tobacco, rice, indigo, that sort of thing. But no, really, it was the procurement, the maintenance, the resale, the insuring, and the overall just system around slavery that really fostered the American economic enterprise. And of course, that went from somewhat of a mercantilist phase into a capitalist phase. So Black people were integral in the United States to America's overall economic development. Now, today, what really matters, because obviously there is no slavery, is the American dream. And we call this the Big Three. And we developed this idea of the American dream around the 1940s or so, right somewhat towards the tail end of the Depression, when sailors or military people, not just sailors, but Army, Merchant Marine, Navy, Marine Corps, and Army Air Corps people were coming back from the war. We needed to do something about these veterans. And so we did things like create the GI Bill. And we did a lot more than that. We did things like building homes, communities that these young men were going to be coming back to. And we also had to do things like create jobs, clear out women from the jobs that they took over for the men who went off to fight in the war. So, what we did in the 1940s is we created what we now know of as the American Dream. And the American Dream consists of three sectors. One is economics, one where people have to essentially have work, and two would be education. And the last one, of course, is housing. These are the things that matter in American politics. So, largely after World War I, the American presidency, the Congress, was principally engaged in trying to expand the wealth of Americans, the education of Americans, and to get Americans properly housed. We've done such a fantastic job at doing these things that we just take it for granted that every American or every immigrant that comes to America desires one of these three things. The problem with this is that all three of these were fraught with racial policies. Racist policies dictated who would make the money, who would get the education, and where people would live and the overall quality of their lives. And this can be seen by what we call the racial wealth gap. So in the United States today, if we were to add up all of the wealth that black people have, white people have, and Latinos have in the United States, we can get a fairly decent barometric reading of how the races have done. Now, you're probably might asking, well, what about other races like Asians, et cetera? Well, Asians represent about 5 to 6% of the overall American population. So we could include them, but since African Americans represent from 13 to 15%, Latinos are approaching around, I would say 30% or so, maybe a little bit less than that. And whites make up about 70%, 65%, something to there. So we'd have to jiggle around the numbers to make this make sense. But those are the three big racial demographics in the United States. So this is the one that people pay most attention to. So if we were to add up all the wealth of all the Latino families in the United States, they would, on average, make up about or they would make up about $8,000 per family. Black people would have about $7,000 per family, and white families, on average, would have about $111,000 per family. And so those numbers, the 102 and the 104, represent the size of the wealth gap with white families. So what does this mean? How is it that the average Latino family in the United States has $8,000? The average black family in the United States has $7,000. And the average white family in America has $111,000. Now, this isn't to say that every single white person has $100,000 or every black family, because we know that there are wealthy blacks, bankers, lawyers, doctors, athletes, musicians, etc., and there are wealthy Latino doctors, lawyers, etc. But when we average, we go from the poorest of poor in the Latino, poorest of poor in the black, and the poorest of poor in the white. We average it out, and this is what they make. And so what you should be asking at this point, how in the world did this happen? Now, you could make the argument just looking at this and said, well, white people just work much, much, much harder than black people or Latinos. Now think about your own families and how hard your parents work. Think about that. Now, I imagine there might be one of you who's sitting out there saying that my family didn't work that hard, but I would venture to say that probably most of you came from families where your parents probably worked really hard. So hard, in fact, that you probably had some duties to do in your house, like helping to raise kids, helping to cook food, all sorts of things. So if your parents are working really hard, that they come home, they're so exhausted that they collapse on the sofa. How is it that with all that hard work, they only have $8,000 in the bank? How? That is the essence of why we say that there is something going on in the United States that helps to foster white wealth and to limit Black and Latino wealth. Now, you probably might also be asking to yourself, well, why is it that Black people have less wealth in the United States than, say, Latinos? And to a large degree, this has to happen from the fact that Black people were largely enslaved. We know 4 million Black people were enslaved, and there were about 300,000 free Black people who were never enslaved. And so you're really literally starting from zero, whereas if you are a Latino, the vast majority of Latinos have come from another place. Now, you may argue that, well, my family came here without anything, and that may be true to some degree, but generally speaking, there is a relationship between home and a relationship between the place that you live now, and Black people just simply do not have that. So let's take a look at home ownership rates. Now, why do we study home ownership rates when it comes to looking at the wealth gap? Because in America, politics after the 1940s, as I stated earlier, was heavily geared towards ensuring that Americans had homes. So in the United States today, 73% of white families own homes, 45% of Black families own homes, and 47% of Latino families own homes. So the statistics between white and Black and Latinos is not very large, but there is a huge gap between where Blacks and Latinos fit within home ownership rates. And you're asking yourself, well, how did that happen? Maybe Black people just do not want to own homes, or Latinos, and that is absolutely not true. Because people in America have common sense enough to realize that the way to wealth in the United States lay with home ownership. So you're asking me, how does that happen? Well, this is how it happens. You buy a home, let's say, theoretically, for $100,000, and you put down $10,000, let's just say, for your home. So just hypothetically, you owe $90,000. If your home is worth $100,000 and you've put down $10,000, you have $10,000 worth of equity in your home. Now, let's say that you work really hard and you put down an additional $40,000 over, let's say, a 5-year period. So now, with your initial seed capital of 10 grand, plus you've worked really hard over the years, working extra jobs, doing whatever you need to do, and you've paid in an extra $40,000. So now all you owe on your home is 50 grand. So what you have is $50,000 worth of equity in your home. That equity is worth something. So what you can do with that equity is you can actually go to a bank and say, look, I have a house that's worth $100,000. I've paid off $50,000. I want a loan for, let's say, $40,000. The bank will gladly give you the money. What are you going to do with that $40,000? Well, what usually white families do with that $40,000 is that they either take that money and they move into a nicer house in a upscale neighborhood, a nicer neighborhood, and they use the money to get their kids into college, and they use it to pay off their kids' college educations. So they're sowing seeds for the future, and they're also buying into a better home. The first home is usually called a starter home. So you buy a home that's worth less in a area or community that is downscale, and later you move into a higher scale, and you can do this 2 or 3 or 4 times. The first house that I bought was worth about $110,000. I bought another house worth about $250,000. And then eventually I kept buying more houses. You just keep doing this repeated over and over again until you get to be as old as I am. And then you live in a really nice house in a really nice neighborhood, and the house is worth a lot of money. So at some particular point, if I decide to sell my house, I will get a substantial amount of money because my house keeps increasing in value. So what does it mentally mean? That means I can either give my house to them wealthier, or I can sell my home and go right off into the sunset with a pocket full of money. That's how home ownership works and makes people wealthy. So then you're asking then, why is it that black people and Latinos just didn't do this? Well, for one, when black soldiers, sailors and Marines, etc., came back from the war, they were refused loans. White military and service members were given loans, but blacks were not. Also, what began to affect blacks and Latinos is a thing called redlining. And what does redlining mean? When you buy a house, you're going to be required by the mortgage company to insure your house. If you can't get insurance and pay for insurance, they're going to pull your mortgage. You will not be able to get one because if your house burns down, you're going to lose your house and the bank will lose its money. So you have to have your house adequately insured at a proper rate. So what happens here? Banks, insurance companies, and realtors conspire against black people and other minorities. They actually take out maps in cities and take a red pen and they draw in red areas where they will only sell to minorities. So the poor houses, they will sell to you if you're a black person. The upper scale houses, no matter how much money you have, they will not sell them to you. So give you an example. When my family left the reservation, my mother wanted to buy a house in a nicer neighborhood in the town that we grew up in. The real estate agent would not, and this is in the early 60s, late 50s, the real estate agent would not take my mother to the area where she wanted to buy because they said it was off limit to black people. But she would sell her a house in an area that was acceptable. Now, my mother could afford a house in a nicer neighborhood, but she was relegated to an area where it was acceptable to sell homes to black people. So what happens is that my mother's house, which was a fairly decent house, was just worth less money than if she would have bought a house in a better neighborhood. That was redlining. What could my mother do about that? Could she sue? No. It was essentially legal to segregate people of color in neighborhoods. In the same town, in that same town, Latinos were restricted into a neighborhood that they called La Colonia. They couldn't live outside of that area. It was a proverbial ghetto. As a young child, I simply could not understand that. I thought to myself growing up that, wow, this is just kind of a place where Latinos like to live. They just like living here. No. Then as I got older, I realized that they had no choice. Those houses in La Colonia were not worth anything. They probably didn't even pay taxes on them because they were just so poorly constructed. So how do you build wealth from that? So redlining was the process by which the banks, the real estate companies, and the insurance companies conspired to keep black people and Latinos and other groups poor. This is institutional racism at its best. Now, let's take a look at the reverberations from this. If you look at across the board, white families, 34% graduated from college. Black families, it's 20%. Latino families, 13%. Interestingly enough, black women now make up the largest percentage of college graduates of all groups. But the gap between black and Latinos is stark. Latinos do not graduate from high school. Certain Asian populations, like the Hmong, don't graduate from high school. This is just absolutely problematic. And it's problematic because college graduates earn more money than non-college graduates. Even if you have an associate's degree and you go out and get a job, you're going to be paid more money because you have an associate's degree. Same thing with a bachelor's degree. Same thing with a master's and PhD. Now, there are people, let's say you can go work for the Los Angeles Police Department, and the Los Angeles Police Department, if you work there after 20 years of working at the LAPD, or 15 years, 19 years, and you move up through the ranks, you'll make $130,000 as a Detective 3. That's good money. It's more than some college professors make, but you know what? College professors don't work a lot. That's the problem. Police officers have to work 8 hours a day and do all that stuff and have the threat of being shot at, and college professors work a couple hours per week. So in real time, even though theoretically you'll find some professors who don't make $130,000, you're working twice as hard for the same amount of money. College education matters. They get the best jobs. They get the best work environments. They get treated better. You're respected. And this is why college matters. Now, you're saying to yourself, well, there are plenty of people who don't have college educations. Yeah, that's true enough. There are plenty of people who don't have college educations. Bill Gates doesn't have a college degree. Bill Gates dropped out of Harvard. But you know what? Bill Gates' family were multimillionaires. He didn't need to go to college. And what's fascinating is that if you look at a lot of people who went to college and dropped out, what they always do is they end up going back. Look at Steven Spielberg. He eventually went and got his degree at Cal State Long Beach. Why did he do that? He didn't need a college degree. Shaquille O'Neal went back to school. Michael Jordan went back to school. Why did they all do that? The Williams sisters went to several institutes and got degrees. They started out doing things like fashion, merchandising, etc., and then they went and got regular college educations. Why on earth would they do that? They do that because they understand when you get a college education, people will just respect you more. It matters. So here is the median wealth return to college graduation. Black family, person without a college degree makes about, survey of income, $4,846. White family, $60,000. That's what it matters to them. That's the difference. College matters. High school matters. Getting a good education matters. This all matters because public policy shapes wealth disparities. If you have politicians who do not care about Black and brown and Asian and Native American life, they will shape policies that discriminate against them. Disparities in wealth will go largely unchangeable without policies that take into account systemic racism. And all of you, I'm quite sure have seen George Floyd, know that this is something that is problematic. So what needs to be done is changes in public policy. And let me just say this when I say public policy. A lot of students come to me and they say, well, I haven't quite figured out what I want to major in college. I'm not quite sure. And I have a basic fundamental rule of thumb. The fundamental rule of thumb is that if you just really don't know what you want to major in college, Major in the thing that's going to pay you the most money. Because even if you don't like it, you'll be making a lot of money. So that's one way to look at it. But if you have an idea what you want to major in, then go for it, right? Do the thing that's going to make you happy and don't listen to anybody else. But if you are thinking about majoring something where you can make a real fundamental change in society, get yourself a solid social sciences degree like in history, political science, sociology, and then go get yourself a master's degree in public policy. You can take that degree in public policy and do so many things. You can work for city governments working on public policy, and then go get yourself a law degree. Right? Go get yourself an engineering degree, a bachelor's degree in engineering, and then go get a master's in public policy. In public policy, if you're focusing in on that, what you need to do is eliminate racial housing disparities. Donald Trump was actually sued because he refused to rent apartments to black people. He lost that lawsuit and was forced to pay out untold millions of dollars. You cannot discriminate against people of color who are looking for adequate housing like my mother was. They eliminated and made rules to stop people from doing that. If they eliminated racial housing disparities, black people's wealth would grow to $32,000 extra. So the gap between white and black wealth would shrink about 31%. Right now, as I'm making this lecture, Donald Trump is trying to eliminate laws that would prevent people from discriminating against minorities. Right now, as we speak. This is absolutely unconscionable. And I'm just going to wait and to see if the Republican Party goes along with this nonsense. If we eliminated racism in housing and its disparities, Latino wealth would increase $29,000. So can you imagine somebody just dropping in your parents' lap $30,000 just right now? An extra $30,000. What would that mean to your family? I don't know about you guys, but if somebody wanted to give me $30,000 today, I would more than take it. In the scheme of things and in the wealth that we have in this country, it's not a lot of money, but $29,000 could pay for literally 2 years at City College and 2 years at Cal State LA. That's good money. So what we mean by the American dream and why it's very important is because we can see that wealth is generated just by being able to access the American dream. So what are some specifics? We should enforce what we have on the books instead of trying to destroy anti-housing discrimination laws. You should be able to buy a house in any neighborhood if you can afford it. Why is that such a problem? The problem is there's people who don't want to live next to you because they do not like you because of the color of your skin. It's as simple as that. There's no way to get around that. That is the basic truth. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac would lower interest rates for minorities. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are basically quasi-government institutions that were specifically charged with helping people to buy homes. So they essentially lend money to banks, and the banks then lend money to groups of people. And what they could do is lower the interest rates for minorities to help them get better homes. They should lower the cap on mortgage deduction. So what you used to be able to do in America. When you bought your house, you would pay a certain amount of tax on your house. You used to be able to take quite a bit of that off on your taxes, but the Republicans have ruined that. So if they could increase the amount of money you can take off on your taxes for what you pay for your house, that would put more money in the pockets of people. Investing in high quality preschool education. If you go to all the jails in the United States and you were to do a survey of people in jail, there would be one common denominator of inmates that you would find. Now, you're going to find a whole lot of things, right? So, for example, people will say that I started hanging out with the wrong people, started doing hardcore drugs, right? All kinds of things. What you will really find out is that most people, not all, but the common denominator in theme for inmates in prisons across the United States is they can't read. So what happens? They go to schools that don't teach them anything, or their home lives are just so chaotic that they can't learn. And so what do? Because school then becomes a chore. People are embarrassed that they can't read. They don't want to go to classes. They just eventually drop out. They can't get a job. How can you get a job if you can't read? You can't even read what your schedule is going to be. Right? So if you get a job at McDonald's and someone says, go look at the schedule and see what your hours are, you can't even read that. I remember I heard a National Public Radio segment where they interviewed a truck driver who couldn't read. I thought that was the most fascinating thing, because what do you need to do to be able to read? You got to read a map and you got to read signs. And so they asked the truck driver, how in the hell do you drive a truck if you can't read? And he says, I memorized where the exits are, and I know that there's the big tree, so that's where I turn. So then how did he find out where to turn in the first place? Well, you kind of think that you're in Tulsa, so you pull over somewhere and you ask somebody to give you directions, and you just work it out. Someone says, well, I need to go drop this off at the Kroger store. Do you know where yeah, it's 3 blocks down. Take a right and go 2 blocks. And that you just figure it out. You have a mental picture of the city that you're driving in your head. But the person talked about the idea of not being able to read and the poorer quality of life that he had. Preschool education is important because if you can't read, your life is going to be hell. Make K-12 funding more equitable. And what do I mean by this? If you live in a poor neighborhood, you're going to go to a poor school because of the tax money. How schools are funded is largely through housing taxes. So in other words, what happens is, let's say that you live in the city of Gardena. The tax money that is collected there goes into the Gardena Unified School System. Gardena schools are okay. They're not great. They're just all right. But Beverly Hills high schools are fantastic. Pacific Palisades high schools are fantastic. Why? Because the tax base in those communities are very high, so the schools get a lot of money, and they have all the great teachers want to teach there. It's the best place to be. They can buy computers at a hat. They don't have to have teachers spending their own money to buy school supplies. So the way to make it more equitable is that when you take tax dollars from Beverly Hills, you ship them over to Gardena. You make it fairer. Recommit to racially integrated schools. You need to send more minorities to Palisades High School and to Beverly Hills High School and Santa Monica High School and all the great high schools. You just need to put more money in those schools. Right now in the United States, schools are probably just as segregated today than they were ever been. Think about your own school. How many whites, Latinos, and blacks went to your school? You probably went to a school where there were all white, all black, all Latino, or maybe you had a lot of Latinos, a few Asians, and a handful of black people. Take a look at Los Angeles City College. We are vastly becoming a Latino college. Nothing wrong with that. All I am saying is that you could end up going to a school that is heavily black, heavily white, etc. The goal is to have equitable integration where you have good numbers of whites, good numbers of blacks, and good numbers of Latinos. You need to learn how to live with different people. You need to find out about different cultures. Basically, what you're going to do when you get right down to it is find out that people want the same thing that you want, no matter what their skin color is, their racial background, their religious background. It doesn't matter where they come from. People want to basically live a good life and feed their families. You need to make colleges more affordable. What we've done at City College and the community colleges in the state of California in general, we worked really hard to try to make college as affordable as possible. When I was in high school, community colleges were free. You could take as many college courses at a community college as you wanted, all free. And everybody did it. Everybody did it because they realized that the quality of education was pretty good. And that you could take all the math and the science and the history and all that stuff and then transfer to UCLA and finish out your education, and you'd be fairly well educated. But now UCLA's $30,000 a year. It's really expensive there now. Probably not as much as $30,000 a year, probably about 15. I don't know. It's gone up so much since I was a student at UCLA, but it's gone up quite a bit. Cal State LA and the Cal States are pretty still reasonable, but they're still even high. When I was at Cal State Dominguez, I could take 2 classes, 3 units each, and it would cost me like $300, something like that. And if I wanted to get into a grad dorm or something, it was an extra couple thousand. It was cheap. Make a college affordable, and that's on your way to wealth. Create job programs, raise the minimum wage to a living wage, make forming unions easier. When I was in college in the 1980s, there was a headstrong program by the Republican Party to destroy unions. Why? Because unions stand in the way of bosses and your employer paying you less money, treating you worse. Simple as that. Unions were the thing that got people better jobs, more money. And Republicans set about to destroy them. Now, when you're studying economics, you need to have the proper sources behind you because sources do matter. You can look at the United States Census Bureau, Survey of Income and Program Participation. You can just take a look at this, the U.S. Census Survey of Income and Program Participation, because they followed households for 2.5 years and they got a lot of data from this. So you can just Google this. The U.S. Census Bureau of Survey of Income and Program Participation. It'll give you a lot of data. Sources matter. Argue from data, and the data will clearly show that we have a unique economic problem in the United States that can only be solved by coherent public policy drives. All right, that's the end of our lecture on income inequality. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.